Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The day my father was buried, the sky stayed stubbornly gray like it didn't want to give us the dignity of a full-on storm, just a low, steady spit of cold spring rain that soaked through everyone's jackets and patience. The church smelled like wax and old wood and grief, and I couldn't decide whether it was the weight of what was happening or the people in the room that made my chest feel like it had a brick sitting on top of it. Every face I saw that morning looked familiar but distant, like they'd once known a version of me they couldn't quite remember how to talk to now. Some nodded politely. Others gave me that sideways glance, the kind you save for the cousin who got into drugs or the uncle who couldn't stop running his mouth at weddings. Mark stood at the front like he belonged there, like it wasn't weird that he was smiling while delivering a eulogy that sounded more like a TED Talk on hard work and legacy than something from a grieving son. His voice didn't even crack once. Not when he talked about our dad's discipline, his standards, his belief in building something that mattered. Not when he said he always wanted his boys to be strong, to earn their keep. Definitely not when he said, some of us lived up to that. Some didn't. I knew that Jab was for me. Everyone did. I sat in the second row, not by choice, but because Uncle Pete practically shoved me into the pew like I still needed instructions on where to sit, like I hadn't spent 35 years figuring out how to avoid being in the damn way. I watched Mark with his perfect posture, his perfect hair, and that self-satisfied smirk tucked just slightly into the corners of his mouth. He was in his element, the center of attention, the responsible one, the one who always knew what to say and when to say it. When the service ended, people gathered in the church hall to drink lukewarm coffee and pick at funeral cookies like that could fill the space grief left. I tried to leave quietly, but I didn't even get halfway to the door before Mark clinked a glass with a butter knife. I turned around, and there he was again, holding court like this was his wedding or a charity gala. "Hey, everyone," he said, real casual, like he was just giving a toast. "There's something I want to say before we all go our separate ways." He looked around like he was savoring the moment. "I wanted to let everyone know that Dad's will has been settled." He left everything, the house, the cars, the lake property, the business shares, to me. There was a pause. A long one. You could hear someone's coffee cup hit their saucer way too loud. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I felt eyes swinging in my direction like someone had yanked them all with a string. Mark went on, like he couldn't help himself. He made that decision because he believed I'd honor his legacy, because he knew I'd protect what he built, and because, frankly, he didn't trust Ethan not to waste it. And just like that, he said it. Right there in front of family, friends, neighbors, former coworkers. Right there while the damn coffee was still hot and the dirt on Dad's grave hadn't settled yet. I heard someone suck in a breath like they were about to object, and then they stopped. Of course they stopped. Why make things messy? I didn't argue. I didn't storm out. I didn't even flinch. I just nodded. One slow, deliberate nod. The kind of nod that could be mistaken for understanding if you weren't paying attention. But the truth is, I wasn't surprised. Not really. Dad had always seen me as the one who couldn't stay on a path. I was the risk. The variable. The kid who went to art school, dropped out, worked odd jobs, traveled, lived in a van for a while, tried writing a book, tried growing mushrooms, tried, well, everything except joining the damn family business like I was supposed to. Mark did it all right. Business school, internships, a wife with symmetrical eyebrows, a mortgage, a spotless SUV, and 2 golden retrievers. If there was a guidebook on how to be the favorite, he ghostwrote it. But what Mark didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been playing a much longer game. And if they thought I'd just disappear into the shadows again, they'd forgotten one very important thing. I may not have been the son my dad wanted, but I sure as hell wasn't stupid. So I let Mark have his moment. Let him beam and shake hands and accept condolences like he was already CEO of the estate. I let the old neighbors pat him on the back and tell him his father would be proud. I even let Aunt Marlene whisper to her daughter that Ethan seems calmer than expected. Maybe he's finally matured. When I finally made it outside, I lit a cigarette even though I quit years ago, just to give my hands something to do. The rain had stopped, but everything still looked wet and raw, like the world hadn't quite cleaned itself up after the funeral. Then I looked back over my shoulder, just once, to see Mark surrounded by people who only saw what he wanted them to. And that's when I smiled. Not wide, not smug, just a little twitch of the lips. Because that was the moment I realized it had worked. And nobody had a damn clue what was coming next. 3 months before my father's funeral, I stood outside his front door holding a 6-pack of shitty beer and a folder that would end up changing everything, though at the time I think I told myself I was just trying to patch things up before it was too late. The air smelled like gasoline and wet grass, and the sky had that yellow tinge it gets right before a thunderstorm blows in and makes everyone quiet for a few minutes. Mark was out of town, some real estate conference in Scottsdale, or whatever shiny place people like him disappear to when they need a break from pretending to be perfect. I knew this was my only chance to talk to Dad without him watching everything I said like a hawk circling a busted rabbit. He opened the door slower than usual, eyes squinting like he wasn't sure if it was really me or just another Jehovah's Witness or Amazon delivery. When he saw me, there was this little flicker of something, not warmth, not quite, but recognition. He stepped aside and muttered, "Didn't expect you." I said, "I brought beer," which was something we used to say back when things were less complicated, and I still gave a damn about impressing him. He gave a grunt that sounded like reluctant approval and let me in. The house looked the same as it always had, dark wood paneling, photos of Mark's kids everywhere, the sharp smell of lemon cleaner clinging to the floorboards like a second skin. He hadn't put up a single picture of me in over 10 years, not since I crashed his birthday party in Denver and gave that speech about how he treated us like investments instead of sons. It wasn't my finest hour, but at least it was honest. We didn't waste much time with small talk. I handed him a beer. He cracked it open, and after a few sips he said, "If this is another pitch for money, you can save your breath." I didn't flinch, just pulled the folder out from under my arm and slid it across the table. "This isn't a pitch. It's something else." He looked at it like it might bite him. "Legal documents?" he asked. "Kind of," I said. "More like protection." That's when the fight started. Not yelling, not fists, that would have been easier. No, this was colder. Sharper. The kind of argument that slices you up slowly with disappointment and digs at every old scar you thought had healed. He told me I was still chasing pipe dreams, still blaming the world for not handing me anything. I told him he raised 2 sons, but only ever saw one. He said, "Mark's never needed saving," and I said, "That's because you never let him fall." He didn't sign anything that day. I didn't ask him to. I wasn't stupid. I knew better than to think I could change his mind in one visit. But I left something behind, tucked into the drawer of his old desk where he kept war medals and the deed to the lake house. A black USB drive labeled, "In case I die." I didn't think he'd look at it. Not right away. Maybe not ever. But I knew he was too paranoid not to at least wonder. 2 weeks later, I got a text from our cousin Lisa saying Dad was asking questions about trusts and shell companies. 2 days after that, I met with a notary at 5 p.m. on Friday the 16th, which was Sunday. Wait, no, Friday was the 14th. I guess I got the date wrong, whatever. Point is, the paperwork got signed. Quietly. Cleanly. Nothing flashy, just some signatures transferring shares of Dad's business assets into a holding company that, on paper, had absolutely no connection to me. No lawyers from his usual circle. No Mark. Just Dad and a man named Harris who smelled like mothballs and kept glancing at his phone like he had somewhere better to be. The documents were intentionally dense, full of language about asset diversification, succession planning, and preservation of proprietary interests. Legalese so thick you'd need a backhoe to dig through it. But Dad signed them anyway. Maybe part of him still wanted to believe I wasn't a complete screw-up. Or maybe he just didn't want Mark to own every last piece of him. Hard to say. Fast forward to 2 weeks before the funeral. Mark calls me out of nowhere, chipper as ever, says he's got some papers that need co-signing. Just a formality, he says. Dad wanted to clean up some things with the trust. I meet him in the parking lot of a Panera Bread, because of course that's where the golden child does business, and he's already got everything printed and clipped. "Here," he says, handing me the pen like he's doing me a favor. "Sign here, here, and here." I flip through them slow, not because I need to, but because I want to make him sweat. I already knew what they were. I'd slipped them in between the standard paperwork. Documents officially transferring power of attorney, financial control, and, here's the kicker, the fallback beneficiary status. All wrapped up in bureaucratic ribbon. And Mark, being Mark, signed every page like he was autographing headshots. No questions. No reading. He thought I was just cleaning up loose ends. He had no idea he'd just given me everything. I smiled at him that day, small and slow, like someone who just won a hand of poker with a pair of twos and a lot of nerve. He didn't notice. He was too busy checking his reflection in the window and bragging about how he was going to renovate the lake house into a luxury Airbnb. "Got to turn Dad's old memories into future income," he said, sipping his green smoothie. I nodded, took the folder back, and told him I'd file everything myself. That night, I poured a whiskey, watched the video of him signing again, recorded from the dashcam in my car, and leaned back in my chair feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Control. And the best part? He still doesn't know what he signed. The thing about people like Mark, the polished ones, the ones who smile too wide when they're winning, is they never look down. They don't have to. The ground's always been there for them, paved, manicured, lined with handrails and subtle applause. They don't notice cracks. They don't notice how fast they're walking. And they sure as hell don't see the trap until it's closed around their foot and they're already halfway through the fall. That's what made the plan possible. Not brilliance. Not luck. Just arrogance, pure, blinding, handcrafted arrogance. Mark had always assumed I was too lazy to understand how things worked. To him, I was the guy who'd fumble through life with duct tape solutions and high ideas that collapsed under their own weight. He wasn't entirely wrong. I'd failed more times than I could count, and I'd spent a lot of years convincing myself I didn't care. But failure's a hell of a teacher when you're willing to listen. And I had been listening for a long damn time. The trust documents were drawn up using a template I got from a business lawyer friend I'd done some website work for back in Austin. Nothing too flashy, just enough to look official, tight, and complicated enough that someone like Mark wouldn't bother reading more than the headers. I spent weeks editing the language, slipping in clauses that looked like insurance policies, but were actually slow-burning fuses. Uncle Pete helped me get them notarized, his eyes squinting under those thick gray brows as he watched the pen hit paper, his mouth twitching at the corners like he wasn't quite sure whether to laugh or pray for my soul. "You sure about this?" he asked me that day, his voice like gravel. "You sure this isn't just you proving a point?" I told him, this isn't about the point. This is about the goddamn game. And once Mark's signature hit those pages, the game was over before he even realized it had started. See, the trust had always been the jewel of the estate, the thing Dad cared about more than anything else. It held the business shares, the land, the dividends, the investments tied to our grandfather's lumber company upstate. And once Dad passed, all of that would naturally fall to Mark unless there was an active transfer already in place. The key word here being active. The documents Mark signed didn't revoke the trust or change its purpose. They rerouted its ownership through a holding company registered in Nevada, one that I controlled under an alias with a backdoor only I could access. The trust still existed, technically untouched. But the hand holding it? That had changed completely. The best part? I didn't even need to forge a thing. Mark signed every page himself, flipping through them with the lazy confidence of a man who's never been told no. I even filmed the whole thing, just in case. Uncle Pete held the camera, pretending to be testing out his new phone while I handed Mark each page with a rehearsed look of polite confusion. "Sorry, man, I know this stuff's dense," I said, and he waved me off like I was an intern getting coffee. "Don't worry about it," he said. "This is just tying up loose ends." Rachel was the first to notice something didn't sit right. She always was the smart one in that relationship, though you'd never know it from the way Mark talked about her like she was part of the furniture. She found the video on their shared iCloud, a glitch, probably, when Pete backed it up using the wrong account. I didn't even realize it had synced there until she called me, 2 weeks after the funeral, her voice tight like a wire pulled too hard. "Did you record Mark signing something?" I didn't lie. "Yeah, I did." There was a long pause. You could almost hear her breath holding back a question it wasn't sure it wanted to ask. "Does he know?" "Nope." She didn't say anything after that. Just hung up. I figured maybe she'd tell him. Maybe she'd blow the whole thing wide open. But she didn't. Not that day. Not the day after either. Maybe it was self-preservation. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe, and this is the one that stuck in my gut, maybe she just wanted to see him squirm too. And he did squirm. Eventually. It happened on a Tuesday morning, bright and stupid with sunshine, when everything should have been ordinary. I was halfway through reheating coffee in the microwave when I heard the knock, not the casual kind, not neighborly or polite, but frantic and off-rhythm like someone was trying not to punch the door outright. I opened it to find Mark standing there, pale as drywall, holding his phone like it was radioactive. "You recorded me," he said. No hello. No preamble. I looked down at the screen. There it was, the video. Crystal clear. Mark's smug face, his hand moving from page to page, his pen scribbling down his name like he was doing the world a favor. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, and he accidentally ran over Dad's prized rose bush with the riding mower. "Does it matter?" I asked, stepping aside just slightly, not enough to invite him in, but enough to let him feel the door was open. He didn't move. He just stared at me like I was a stranger. "You tricked me." "No," I said, slow and even. "You assumed. There's a difference." And that's when it started to dawn on him, not just that he'd signed away something important, but that he didn't even know how much. That video was just the tip of it. He hadn't seen the accounts. He hadn't seen the email logs. He hadn't seen what was already done, already moved, already closed off to him forever. He opened his mouth to say something else, maybe to yell, maybe to beg, but nothing came out. So I just stood there, watching him process it, sipping my coffee like it was any other Tuesday. Because for me, it was. Mark didn't come back the next day, and honestly, I didn't expect him to. Pride like his doesn't fold easy. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't even know the language of humility, and for all his smugness, I knew one thing for sure: he was going to take time to convince himself he was still in control before he even thought about talking to me again. But when he did show up, 3 days later, it was clear that whatever illusion he'd been clinging to had finally snapped. He looked like hell, and I don't say that lightly. His shirt was wrinkled, half tucked into his slacks like he'd gotten dressed in the dark, and the circles under his eyes looked like bruises he'd earned from insomnia. He didn't knock this time. He just pounded on the door until I opened it and then pushed past me into the living room like we were still teenagers fighting over who got the remote. I didn't stop him. I let him pace. I let him breathe heavy and spin in that hurricane of anger and desperation he'd built around himself. I sat down on the couch, cracked open a beer, and waited. That pissed him off even more. "You smug little bastard," he spat, standing over me like he was trying to reclaim some sense of height. "You think you're clever? You think this makes you smart?" I took a sip, let the silence stretch for just a second too long. "No, Mark," I said calmly, looking him dead in the eye. "I know it makes me smart." That's when the shouting really started. He threw his hands up, started pacing again, rambling about family betrayal and lawsuits and how I'd manipulated a grieving old man into screwing over his own blood. I could practically see the script playing out behind his eyes, every word perfectly rehearsed for some imagined courtroom where he'd be the wounded hero and I'd be the ungrateful burnout dragging the family name through the mud. I let him finish. I let him run the whole speech out of his system because I knew something he didn't. He had nothing. No leverage. No evidence. No legal ground. All he had were feelings, and if there's one thing the law doesn't give a damn about, it's hurt feelings, especially when they belong to someone who signed everything of his own free will. When he finally stopped talking, chest heaving, I reached over and grabbed the folder sitting on the coffee table. The same folder he'd handed me weeks ago, full of papers he never read. I opened it slowly, deliberately, like I was peeling back the last layer of his denial. You want to sue me? I asked. Go ahead. But let me walk you through what that'll look like. I showed him the notarized pages first, complete with signatures, timestamps, and video backups. Then came the holding company documents, the power of attorney filings, the amended trust deed. Every page bore his name in that same smug scrawl, and everyone told the same story. A man so sure of his own superiority that he didn't bother to check the ground before he jumped. He stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something else if he just looked long enough. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw real panic behind his eyes. You tricked me, he said again, but quieter now, like he didn't believe it anymore. No, I repeated, just as calm. You underestimated me. It was around that time Rachel walked in. She didn't knock either. She just stepped inside, holding her phone like a piece of evidence and wearing the kind of look that tells you a person isn't choosing sides, they're choosing clarity. Mark froze when he saw her, like he'd been caught cheating at cards and didn't know whether to fold or flip the table. She didn't look at him. She looked at me. Did you do this because of the will? She asked, her voice tired, but not judgmental. I shrugged. The will was just the excuse. The truth? I did it because I got tired of being ignored. Tired of being treated like a mistake instead of a person. She nodded, then turned to Mark and asked, You knew about this? I didn't know what I was signing, he snapped. Arms folded like that somehow made him the victim. That's the problem, she said. You never do. He stared at her like she'd slapped him. Then he turned back to me, eyes glassy now, all that rage dissolving into something messier. You don't understand what you've done. This business. Dad's work. Everything we built. I didn't take it to destroy it, I said. I took it because I finally could. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being played. He sat down then. Just sat, like someone had pulled the batteries out of him. I don't think I'd ever seen Mark still for that long. Not even as a kid. He was always moving, always winning, always performing. But now? He looked like a man who finally realized the stage had been pulled out from under him. I finished my beer and stood up. He looked up at me, eyes narrowing. So what now? You gonna kick me out? Take the business? Sell the lake house? Maybe, I said, walking toward the kitchen. Maybe not. His voice rose again, that last flicker of ego trying to spark. You think this makes you better than me? I turned, leaned against the doorframe, and looked him straight in the face. There's one more thing you haven't figured out yet. He blinked. What? I didn't answer. I just let it hang there, thick as smoke in the room, heavy with the weight of everything he didn't know and everything I wasn't ready to tell him. Not yet. The last time I watched the video, I wasn't drinking anything fancy or dramatic, just a lukewarm bottle of domestic beer, the kind that's always a little disappointing but never bad enough to toss out. The footage had been sitting on a backup drive for weeks, just waiting. I hadn't needed it yet, hadn't even shown it to anyone besides Uncle Pete, who just shook his head and muttered something like, "That boy talks too damn much." But now, with Mark on the verge of crumbling and Rachel asking questions neither of us were ready to answer, it felt like the right moment to let the truth play out on screen. It was all there, in that quiet little dashcam video, nothing fancy, no fancy angles, no edits, no soundtrack, just grainy footage of Mark leaning against my car, wearing his typical blazer, and that overpriced watch he wouldn't shut up about. He looked relaxed. Confident. The papers were in his hands, fluttering slightly in the breeze as he signed them one by one. I'm off to the side, mostly out of frame, but you can hear me saying, "You sure you don't want to read through these again?" Just being cautious, you know. Covering my ass. And Mark, oh, Mark, he just laughs, that short, smug little chuckle that always sounded like someone who believed they were surrounded by idiots. If there's one thing I know, he says, flipping to the next page, it's that you've never been able to pull off anything smart enough to worry me. He signs. Keeps talking. You're a dreamer, Ethan. Always have been. Big ideas, no follow-through. It's sad, honestly. But I guess Dad needed someone to blame stuff on, and you were the perfect punching bag. Then he signs the last page, hands me the pen, and says, "You're lucky I even let you be involved in this." Try not to screw it up. That was the part I'd been waiting for. That line. Because as much as the paperwork mattered, as much as the legal transfers and the hidden shell company and the financial trail all built the scaffolding of the plan, that sentence, those 17 or so words, were the finishing nail in the coffin of Mark's illusion. It was his arrogance, preserved in pixels, immortalized by his own hand. And that, more than anything else, proved everything I'd ever tried to say about him. Rachel watched the video sitting across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap like she was afraid they might betray her if she let them move. I didn't narrate. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. She understood exactly what she was seeing. When it ended, she didn't say anything for a while. Then she stood up slowly and asked if she could send it to herself. I nodded. She took out her phone, airdropped it, and left without another word. That night, Mark called me 3 times. I didn't answer. I figured if he wanted to talk, he could try showing up again, but I knew he wouldn't. Not now. Not after Rachel saw it. Not after she packed up a suitcase and left his ass sitting in the kitchen like a child who broke a window and couldn't figure out how. I heard she's staying at her sister's for now, maybe longer. She didn't say goodbye. I don't think she thought it was necessary. There was something deeply satisfying in the silence that followed, not triumphant, not joyful, but full. Complete. Like finishing a puzzle that's been missing a single piece for 10 years and then finding it under the couch one day without looking. I'd love to say that what I did was purely about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine or punishing Mark for years of belittlement and passive-aggressive power moves, but that wouldn't be entirely honest. The truth is messier than that, and if I'm being real with myself, I didn't just want him to lose. I wanted him to know he lost. I wanted him to look back at every time he rolled his eyes at me, every backhanded comment at family dinners, every sideways glance that told me I was embarrassing or inconvenient or less than, and realize I had been listening the whole damn time. And I wanted him to sit in the wreckage and understand that no one else did this to him. No lawyer tricked him. No stranger snuck into the family finances in the night. He signed every page. He laughed while doing it. He made it easy. In the days that followed, I got a few messages from extended family, some supportive, some confused, a few outright pissed. People like to believe the version of events that makes them most comfortable, and for years, the easy story was that Mark was the responsible one and I was the screw-up. Now that the narrative's shifting, they're scrambling for a new label, a new angle, some kind of neat conclusion. I'm not giving them one. Let them wonder. Uncle Pete called me late that Friday night after it all hit the fan. He just said, "Well, you finally did it." I asked if he thought I'd gone too far. He took a long pause, then said, "No. I think you finally played the hand you were dealt instead of folding. I don't know if what I did makes me a hero or a bastard. Probably a bit of both. Depends who you ask, I guess. But I didn't do it for them. I didn't do it for redemption or revenge or even money, though the money's nice, I won't lie. I did it because I was tired of letting other people write my story for me. Tired of being cast as the mess-up, the joke, the well, at least he's trying relative. I walked away from all of it the next week, sold off a few properties, moved into a smaller place out by the coast, started writing again. Nothing big, nothing serious. Just words on a page, finally mine, finally free of that voice in the back of my head asking, what would Mark think? Maybe I did waste some things in my life. But not this moment. Not this one.